So this week we're going to be looking at the macroeconomic policies that governments use to try to keep their economies going at full strength. So by the end of this video, you should be able to understand what are those government objectives that governments have for their economic policy. You should, by the end of the video, be able to distinguish between two types of macroeconomic policy, demand side and supply side. In this video, we're going to particularly focus on monetary policy, so you should be able to understand that and also be able to comment on how effective monetary policy is in tackling specific macroeconomic objectives. So what are the key objectives of macroeconomic policy, of any macroeconomic policy? Well, they're pretty much the same for any government in any country. All governments want stable prices, which in the UK we measure using CPI, but however it's measured, that's something that all governments want. No governments want high inflation. All governments want sustainable growth, GDP rising, because rising GDP enables higher average living standards and can, but not always does, can reduce inequality. At the same time, rising GDP, we hope, will lead to falling unemployment, and that's another objective. Nearly every government wants more jobs to keep people happy and to keep people in a position where they can look after themselves. And finally, improved global competitiveness. Competitiveness is often a key objective of macroeconomic policy. So let's have a look at that again in terms of this diagram that we've seen before, the business cycle or the economic cycle. We see the dotted blue line, which is the trend line for economic growth, whereas the green line that goes up and down is actual GDP. And we've learned that most economies tend to grow in this cyclical way, as the green line shows, and they move between peaks and troughs, between periods of recession and expansion. Now that's not ideal because we've just said that governments have an objective for low inflation. Well, we know at the peak of the economic cycle, we tend to get higher inflation. We've also learned that governments have an objective for low unemployment. And we know that at the trough in the economic cycle, unemployment tends to rise. So really, in an ideal world, governments would like their economy to grow in a steady, sustainable way along this trend line. So we can think of macroeconomic policy as constantly trying to get the peaks reduced down to be nearer to this trend line and to get the troughs pushed up to be nearer to the trend line, so that we constantly have less inflation and less unemployment. That's what governments would like, and that is kind of what the macroeconomic policies aim at. So, when we're thinking about macroeconomic policy, there are really two kinds. Demand side, which we're going to start looking at in a minute, and the name speaks for itself. Demand side policies try to impact aggregate demand. The other type of policy that government uses is supply side. And guess what? Those are policies that try to impact aggregate supply. So we're going to look at supply side policies in a later video. And for now, we're going to focus on demand side policies, of which there are two types. So demand side policies can be split into fiscal policy, which is all about the level of taxation and government spending. And the other kind of demand side policy is a monetary policy. And that's what we're going to focus on in this video. We'll come back to fiscal policy again in a later video. So, monetary policy, what is it? Well, as the name suggests, it's all about controlling money. It's about controlling the money supply, and it's about controlling the cost of money. And when I talk about the cost of money, I really mean interest rates. So monetary stability means stable prices. Remember, that was one of the government's objectives, stable prices. It means keeping inflation low because that helps to maintain the value of our currency in a global market. Now, every government will define its own inflation target. In the UK, it's the Bank of England, actually, that defines the UK's inflation target, and that happens through the Monetary Policy Committee. And in fact, the inflation target for the UK is 2% at the moment, and that's quite a common inflation target for many economies. So most governments want prices to rise a little bit because that tells us that there is a bit of growth in the economy, there's some demand there. But we don't want inflation very high because that will reduce the value of our money and it creates uncertainty for businesses and for consumers. So 2% or a figure close to that is a very common objective for monetary policy, 2% inflation. So what kind of inflation have we had in the UK over the last 20 years? Well, the dotted red line that you can see going across this graph is the 2% mark, and you can see that in the UK, at times inflation has been lower than that, and at times it's been higher. So we see that kind of cycle going on, but it hasn't been too far away from that. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail about monetary policy and what it is. So the three headlines really that monetary policy is all about are interest rates, first of all. The government sets the rate of interest, the basic rate of interest which is used in the economy. And this really is the cost of money. If we borrow money, we have to pay interest for it, for the privilege. And if we save money, we get paid interest. So interest rates are a key part of monetary policy. But also governments control the rules around lending money. How easy is it for banks to lend money to businesses and to consumers? How easy is it for businesses and consumers to borrow money? Are there lots of regulations around that? Are there lots of restrictions? Governments can set that and they can make it easier or harder for banks to lend and for people to borrow. And those two things will often have an effect on the value of the currency as well. So that's tied up with the same thing. So when we think about monetary policy, we can think about two faces of monetary policy, if you like. If we're in a period of the economic cycle where we have inflation, that might be because we've got loose monetary policy. So loose money policy is a situation in an economy where it's easy to borrow money. It's easy for both consumers and for businesses. So consumers buy more because they can borrow money. Businesses spend more. They invest in their businesses more because borrowing is easy and cheap. And the result of that is that there are more jobs, more people are employed, and those people who now have jobs, they go and spend money as well. So the effect of loose money policy is to increase consumer spending and to increase business investment, and both of those things together will have the effect of increasing aggregate demand. And eventually that might lead to inflation. Inflation will go up. On the other hand, if we've got tight monetary policy, the key features of that is that the government might make it very difficult for both consumers and businesses to borrow. They might have lots of rules and regulations about how banks lend money. And the interest rate might be high, so it puts people off borrowing money. So the result of that is that consumers buy less, businesses put off their expansion, therefore unemployment starts to increase a bit and production is reduced, and the economy begins to slow and contract. So let's look at that in a slightly different way. If an economy is in a period of a trough period where aggregate demand is very low, then the government might use that expansionary monetary policy or loose money policy, we called it on the previous slide. So they would use expansionary monetary policy to increase aggregate demand to get the economy going again. So they might reduce the level of interest rates so that it becomes cheaper for consumers and businesses to borrow money. They might also put measures in place to make it easier for banks to lend money to businesses and to consumers. And both of these things are likely to have the effect of making the value of the currency a bit lower in real terms, because that increase, that reduction in interest rates and a greater ease of borrowing money is going to increase aggregate demand, and therefore it's likely to increase inflation, and so the currency loses its value a little bit. So in a period where the economy is very slow, governments will often use expansionary monetary policy just to get the economy going again, to get consumers spending money, to get businesses spending money. On the other hand, if we're at that peak of the economic cycle, where there's lots of demand in the economy, and as a result we've got high inflation, then governments might use deflationary monetary policy. They might increase interest rates to make it more expensive for people to borrow money, both businesses and consumers. But equally, it's not just more expensive to borrow, it makes it more attractive to save your money. So if interest rates are high, I might well be tempted to save my money rather than spend it. So that's another downward pressure on consumer spending. Deflationary monetary policy also involves tightening the credit supply. In other words, making it more difficult for people to get loans, increasing the restrictions around banks lending money. And again, the result of that is that the currency is likely to get stronger. And that's important because a stronger currency means that exports are likely to fall and imports are likely to increase, which is another way of reducing aggregate demand. So we're going to look at that again in the same thing, slightly different way. So we start with the bank lowering interest rates from 20% down to 5% and making it easy for people to borrow. So it's cheap to borrow now, it's easy to borrow. Consumers and businesses are going to borrow more. And what do they do with that money? Well, they spend it. And when they spend that money, that creates more demand. And that demand creates more jobs. So this is how expansionary monetary policy works. It encourages both consumers and businesses to spend, and therefore it increases aggregate demand and increases employment, reduces unemployment. But of course it is likely to cause a little bit of inflation. Same thing again, slightly different way of looking at it. This time we're looking at deflationary or contractionary monetary policy. So, in this example, interest rates rise. Now don't forget, governments could also here make it more difficult for businesses to borrow money. They might put rules in place to make that more difficult, but the effect is the same. Interest rates rise. Now, most people in the UK borrow money to buy their house. They have a mortgage. So if interest rates rise, we're all going to pay more for our mortgage, and therefore we have less money to spend. We have less discretionary income as consumers, and so our consumer spending falls. At the same time, businesses want to invest less because it's more expensive for them to borrow. So they decide perhaps to put off opening their new shop or to wait a while before they invest in a new computer system. They don't want to do it now because borrowing is expensive. So business investment falls. Because interest rates are high, the pound tends to get stronger. The pound will get stronger against other currencies. And the result of that is that it becomes cheaper for me, because my pound is now worth so much more, it becomes cheaper for me to buy imports, but it becomes more expensive for people in other countries to buy our exports. So all of these things combine together to cause aggregate demand to fall. So that's happened because consumer spending has fallen, business investment has fallen, and net trade has fallen as well. All all of these combine to give us a falling aggregate demand. And the result of that is that inflation is likely to fall, but unemployment is likely to rise and economic growth slows. So, monetary policy used in this way, in a contractionary or deflationary way, is only going to be used when the economy is really overheating, when it is at one of those peaks and prices are rising too quickly. This is where governments put the brakes on and try and slow everything down. So monetary policy isn't perfect. It comes with its problems as well. The first one is that it's not instant. So if governments decide to change interest rates or to change the ease with which credit can be granted, it takes a while for those changes to work their way through into the economy. And by that time, perhaps demand will have changed anyway. So monetary policy is not an exact science. It's impossible to know exactly how consumers and businesses will respond. We don't always behave in the standard way that we're expected to. And there are many other factors which affect cost and prices, which can change the inflation risk. It's not just about lending money, is it? It's not just about money. So there are other things at play here which can reduce the effectiveness of monetary policy sometimes. And of course, monetary policy doesn't work in isolation. Often governments will use monetary policy alongside other policies as well to try and impact aggregate demand in the way that they're trying to. And the other thing is that the objectives of monetary policy can change. And so the way that monetary policy is used needs to change carefully with that as well. And it needs to change at the right time. And we've already said that that can be difficult. Okay, we're going to finish there. In the remaining videos, we're going to look at fiscal policy and also supply side policy. But for now, there are a few questions for you to answer.